I said to you at the beginning of our discussion that this article is important for us to read not only for its findings, but also for the people who wrote it. Case and Shiller, literally the two most famous, prominent economists of the housing market. The index in the United States that tracks housing prices bears their name. You don't get more prestigious than these guys. 2002, the two most important economists write an article saying, please review both our qualitative and our quantitative evidence to see if there are bubble conditions in the market. Who is this article being written for? This is actually a private conversation, basically, between the two most prominent economists of the housing market on one side. Who's on the other side of that conversation? One man. Give me one name. Alan Greenspan. Right? Alan Greenspan sets interest rates. What's the best, easiest way to prick a bubble? Raise the cost of credit, right? Because housing prices relate to the cost of credit. If it's simply too expensive to borrow the money that you need to move into a house, you're not going to move into the house at that price. So this is essentially a private conversation between Case and Shiller on the one hand and Alan Greenspan on the other, saying, dear Mr. Greenspan, look at the numbers that we've got for you. Look at what people are thinking when they look at this market. They expect higher than average return at lower than average risk. It's a cognitively dissonant market. You should do something about it. This is dangerous. Look at the conclusions that they give. It's couched in economies, but let me tell you, for economies, it's pretty dire. We might see replenishment of the savings rate, collapse in consumer confidence, and so on, right? Bad outcomes, in other words. If this market, if it is a bubble, when it falls, there could be very dire consequences. Indeed, you should act. What did the Federal Reserve Board choose to do in 2002, 2003? Keep interest rates at record lows, right? I think it was at like 0.5 or 0.75, something like that. Very, very low after the collapse of the stock market, an attempt to try and spur recovery. Interest rates are at record lows. Here, the two most prominent economists of the housing market present, I think we would argue, unimpeachable evidence that there is a bubble or bubble conditions forming, that the expectations of market participants are characterized by irrationality. The math in the article makes it pretty clear that prices are no longer tethered to the underlying fundamentals. What does the Federal Reserve Board choose to do given that evidence? Nothing whatsoever. Why? Why did Alan Greenspan and the Federal Reserve Board choose to ignore the evidence that there were housing bubble conditions forming in the market with all of the attendant dire consequences? I'm going to submit to you it's because the minds at the Federal Reserve Board knew something that Case and Shiller didn't, which was that their findings were irrelevant because their reading of the market was outdated. This was a different market than the market in 1988. Therefore, using this kind of methodology didn't make sense. They were bringing basically old tools to a new reality. Because this market, the market of 2002, was characterized by much, much more effective mechanisms to disperse risk. It was a much more efficient market than the market in 1988. In other words, don't worry. This time is different. It's going to be okay. The reason I feel comfortable in saying that is because if we look at Alan Greenspan and we look at his record over the period that he was a central banker, one of the things that we find Alan Greenspan saying over and over and over again is, this is a new market, there are new ways of dispersing risk, more efficient than ever, and we should just leave it alone, and everything will be fine. We also know this because there were numerous attempts late 1990s on by the government of the United States to regulate this new market for risk dispersal. We now know them as CDOs and CDSs, secondary and tertiary derivative products, synthetic derivative products, packaged, sliced and diced, securitized instruments, and so on. There were numerous attempts to regulate that market because it was a market characterized by opacity. There wasn't a lot of transactional clarity in that market, and so there was all these voices saying we should bring some more regulation to this market. We should ensure that people know what's going on here. And every single time, I shouldn't say every single time, but over and over and over again, the voice that was raised, the voice that had the most authority and persuasiveness that was raised against regulating this market, that voice belonged to, guess who? Alan Greenspan. Alan Greenspan gave speeches, gave testimony, would tell anyone who listened, do not introduce unnecessary regulation to this secondary and tertiary market. It's very effective. There are good moral hazard guards in place. It's extremely good at dispersing risk. And ultimately, it helps make everybody more prosperous because of that new risk dispersal mechanism. So don't mess it up by imposing some kind of a regulatory regime over it. Now, as we know, Alan Greenspan got that wrong because he went back to Congress and told them he made a mistake, which is rare because usually central bankers simply hide from their mistakes. You don't hear from them much. So I actually have to go back and say, yeah, maybe I got a couple of the details wrong. Is really quite remarkable. Why had Alan Greenspan and other members of the Fed, how had they gotten it so wrong? How could they have so misread these circumstances? Greenspan said, well, I misread the ability of the banks to act in a way that was in the interest of their shareholders. As if the principal agent problem had never existed before in 2007. Give bankers a whole lot of incentive and a whole lot of ways to make a ton of money and be shocked that they decide to do so. Really? Good heavens. Why had Greenspan and the Fed, why did they make such a colossal mistake? Why didn't they take this article as a clarion call to raise rates, prick the bubble now, avoid the catastrophic consequences? Instead, what did they do? They kept interest rates low, and what was already a bad situation became much, much worse, such that when it finally did collapse in 2007, we almost went into global-wide economic catastrophe. I'm going to argue it's because Alan Greenspan had told himself a story. He told himself a story about risk dispersal. He told himself a story about efficient markets, that these tertiary, secondary and tertiary derivative instruments were exactly what he said they were in his own mind, that they were in fact effective mechanisms at moving risk into a much larger market, and therefore it was different this time. Therefore it was a different kind of market, and therefore these kinds of findings weren't relevant. And once he told himself that story, that was the truth that he acted on, became his truth. That's the problem, that's the power of narrative. Once we've told ourselves that story, we don't know that it's a story. We just know that it's true. Whether it's Japanese investors who are supporting your house price in San Francisco in 1988, or whether it's the efficient operation of a market that's obviously in catastrophic bubble territory because of these wonderful new instruments available to us to disperse risk. The stories that we tell ourselves operate as our truth unless we try to interrogate them as stories.